Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss Palm Sunday, also known as Passion Sunday, also known as Palm Passion Sunday for those of you who are indecisive, which falls on April 2nd this year. We have 2 content notifications for you for this episode. We talk about suicide and antisemitism connected to Judas somewhat when discussing the deep dive.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive for this week is on Judas, because you get the feeling that he's a fairly important character in the Bible, and maybe we should talk about him on occasion.
And particularly in Holy Week,
Yeah,
he's a fairly important character.
Probably, yeah. And so I thought that we could start off by just giving the short version of our individual thoughts on Judas. I find Judas a very interesting character, despite the fact that he doesn't spend a lot of time on screen, as it were, in the Bible, in part because there's this whole...
There were no screens 2,000 years ago?
He's not on the page that often in the Bible, and we don't actually know that much about him in general, but there's this ongoing thing in a few of the Gospels that he's being controlled by Satan, and then there's also this ongoing thing sort of just across all of the stories of what he does has to happen in order for Jesus' story to be complete. And so is he truly responsible for his actions, or is God controlling him, or is he just playing a part in the story? Or, it's hard to tell. The gospel authors clearly see him as a traitor and a betrayer and the, vilest of vile fiends, basically. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. And I find it very telling that Jesus never says that he hates Judas. Jesus calls him a friend, calls him a disciple, and I think at least once says that he loves all of his disciples.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly a few times,
yes.
And he never takes that back for Judas.
We'll get more into Jesus' feelings about Judas when we get to John, because I wrote an entire paper on that in seminary.
Yes.
I have a soft spot in my heart for Judas. Judas is tricky biblically because he is portrayed a little bit differently in each of the Gospels, and as you said, Kay, it is very clear that what Judas does is required in some capacity. Yeah. And there's also some scholarship of Judas being misguided, and that comes out in a lot of ways in the book Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff, Christ's Childhood Pal, which is not at all purporting to be any sort of canonical, apocryphal, anything, but is delightful, by Christopher Moore. Judas is a zealot and is trying to stir up the revolution. And a lot of people thought the Messiah was going to come and lead this revolt against the powers that were oppressing and occupying the Jewish people. And so that was understanding Judas as a character who was trying to set up the circumstances so that Judas, as the Messiah, would do what he's supposed to do and take on the army and take on the police and all of that stuff, is oh, I can see where you're coming from, however misguided, however much you clearly didn't understand what Jesus was actually about and saying when he was talking about being the Messiah. But I get that your heart was not in a bad place for this. You weren't intending to kill God or anything.
There is no necessary twirling mustache.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, Judas. Judas is actually the Greek form of the name Judah, which means praised or God is thanked. So, as you might imagine, Judas was not an uncommon name. Just in general, in Judaism, anybody that had Greek versions of their names, it would have been fairly reasonable to name their kid Judah or Judas, because Judah was the son of Jacob/Israel. So it was pretty common in general within Judaism. And then add into it that it was an extra common name in Jesus' day because of Judas Maccabeus, or Judah Maccabee, a Jewish priest and the son of Mattathias, who led the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire in 167 to 160 BCE. And that event is commemorated by the holiday called Hanukkah, where the Jewish people finally were able to return to worshiping in the second temple after Judas Maccabee removed the Greek gods from it and then purified it. So that's like Judas as a name is upheld and is like a celebrated and common name. More so Judah, but they were in Greek speaking places, so Judas.
Sure, that makes sense. So Judas, as may not surprise you, shows up in all 4 Gospels.
What?
Strangely enough. And so we're going to go through and talk about how Judas appears in each of the Gospels individually, because as it turns out, each of the 4 Gospels is different. That's why we have 4 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes paying attention to those differences can really be helpful and show us how each gospel has different things that they emphasize or want to pay attention to. So let's start with Mark, which is not the first gospel listed in your Bible table of contents, but it was the first gospel written and is also noticeably the shortest. So Mark characterizes Judas as Jesus' betrayer the very first time he's introduced in chapter 3, and then in chapter 14, Judas goes to the chief priests after the woman with the alabaster jar anoints Jesus. And in this particular scene, when the woman with the alabaster jar shows up, some who are there object to how expensive her ointment for Jesus is, but it's not specified who exactly it is. And the chief priests offer Judas money without him asking for it, and they give him an unspecified amount for him to betray Jesus. He is there for the communion on what is essentially the first Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper, because all 12 disciples are specified to be there, but he isn't particularly mentioned personally. So like he is there for the meal. Yeah, not by name. And then a little while later, he appears with the soldiers in the garden to arrest Jesus, and he betrays Jesus with a kiss.
Scandalous.
So the soldiers will know which person is Jesus. And then he's not seen again at all after that. No, not even in the long ending of Mark, although why would we pay attention to that anyway?
It's just a fanfic.
Yes, and not actually a good one.
Yeah, it's one of those
if
bad
it was a good
fanfics.
one, we'd be more of a fan of it, but yeah.
Yeah, no, the long ending in Mark is definitely not a good fanfic.
Yeah.
It's a bad one. And then in the Gospel of Matthew, which is the gospel that we are in this year, and so a lot of you who are going to be experiencing particularly Passion Sunday are likely to hear about Judas from the Gospel of Matthew, though some of you will probably get the Gospel of John for this week. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Judas is characterized as Jesus' betrayer the first time he's introduced as well, though that's not until chapter 10.
Yeah, I was going to say Matthew is longer. That's fair.
Matthew's twice as long as Mark, so it's still a little bit later, probably chronologically, but not a big difference. So Judas goes to the chief priests, aka the super bigwigs, in chapter 26. So this is very close to the end of Matthew. Right after, also, a woman with an alabaster jar anoints Jesus' feet. And in that story, all of the disciples are upset about this and how much it costs.
Yeah.
How much money is, quote unquote, wasted on anointing Jesus' feet. And in this account, as we'll talk about later in this episode, Judas asks the price for the chief priests, and they give him 30 pieces of silver, which is a sizable but not life-changing amount of money, as again, we'll talk about later. And then Judas does stay for communion on Maundy Thursday in the Gospel of Matthew. When they're all talking about who will betray Jesus, Judas says, "Surely not I." To which Jesus responds like, "You have said so. You said it." And then when Jesus is in the garden, Judas appears with the soldiers to arrest him and betrays him with a kiss after Jesus tells him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." After Jesus is arrested, Judas does repent, tries to return the silver, and then unalives himself by hanging.
Yeah.
So there's this gospel is one where there's this complexity to Judas that I think is really important. Like there
Yeah.
is a repentance, there is a, oh no, what have I done?
Right.
And then trying to undo some of it and not being able to, and
Yeah.
failure of imagination, running out of other options, doesn't see a way for
Right.
it to end well.
And so in the Gospel of Luke, again, the Gospel of Luke characterized Judas immediately as the one who would become a traitor when he is first introduced, this time in chapter 6. And also, hilariously, in the Gospel of Luke, there is another one of the 12 disciples who is also named Judas, but that one is the son of James. And so good luck keeping those separate in your head while you're reading through the Gospel. It was
Right.
real fun doing the word search.
Yeah. Well, and that in Luke, there's some tradition around like they wanted to have a good Judas and a bad Judas, and that's why they changed.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I haven't heard
that character in the other Gospels would be Thaddeus.
Sure.
It's unclear of if that's real or just made up to be made up, but
okay.
That's part of what they've said.
And then in chapter 22, the next time he shows up, Satan enters into Judas at that point, and he goes to the chief priests and the temple police, both of which are named specifically, to betray Jesus, and they agree to pay him an unspecified amount of money, and he agrees to betray Jesus specifically when there is not a crowd around Jesus. In this gospel, there's no mention of a woman with an alabaster jar in the previous couple of chapters. I think the woman with the alabaster jar shows up at some point, but it's not connected to Judas going off to betray Jesus.
Yeah, I was going to say they always have a woman who anoints Jesus in some capacity in the Gospels, but
yeah, but it's not connected to that. And then Judas is going to go betray Jesus with a kiss and is like walking towards Jesus to do that and doesn't actually get to it before Jesus says, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?"
Or the Son of Humanity, or the Chosen One, depending on your...
Yes, NRSV says Son of Man, but yeah, all those work. And so presumably Jesus either was telepathic or possibly Judas was like really making the smooch face. I don't know.
Like you do with a 3-year-old.
Exactly. Don't treat Jesus like a 3-year-old. That does not sound like it's going to work out well in the long run, I'm just saying.
Unless it's actually 3-year-old Jesus.
And well, yes, I suppose, sure. And then Judas is not seen again in the Gospel of Luke after that, but since Luke was also written by the author of the book of Acts, he is mentioned in chapter 1 of the book of Acts. And in passing, it said that he was given a field in exchange for betraying Jesus, and while he was in that field, he fell down and, quote, he burst open in the middle and all his bowels gushed out. Okay.
That sounds terrible.
And the field after that was known as the Field of Blood. So, not really clear on exactly what happened, but I don't think we need to be, and, let's not get to the point where we have to give a warning for gore. So.
Yeah. I think that's part of what gets skipped in the lectionary for the beginning of Acts.
Yeah, no, strangely enough, we don't read that part a lot, no.
Huh, weird. Mm-hmm. And then, Judas and John.
Yes, I did make Emily do both Matthew and John for this episode.
I know. Yeah, I noticed that and commented on it, and then was like, well, then I get to talk about my paper. Done. So at the end of chapter 6, Jesus says, "Did I not choose you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." And the next verse specifies that he's talking about Judas, who would betray him. So that's kind of the introduction of Judas, that for every gospel, like in some capacity, Judas is designated as the one who would betray Jesus. And in the Gospel of John, Judas is the one specifically by name who objects to the woman with the alabaster jar's ointment being too expensive because he keeps the purse. So he keeps track of the money and stole from the common purse. So he knows how much is not there that should be. And that happens in chapter 12. And it's mentioned at that point that he is about to betray Jesus. And then in chapter 13, we read that the devil has already put it into Judas's heart to betray Jesus. And so that's right before the foot washing, which is frequently read on Maundy Thursday for part of the Last Supper gospel. And then in the Gospel of John, Jesus hands Judas a piece of bread to illustrate to the other disciples who will betray him later in chapter 13. And then Satan enters Judas and he leaves. But some of the disciples think he's running an errand for Jesus because he has the money. So maybe they weren't paying attention.
Wait, the disciples not paying attention? I have no idea how
Weird.
that could possibly happen.
I don't know. Weird how that works. But that's also, like, that's the part that I wrote the paper on, that there's a way of looking at that part of the story as a merism, where Jesus, because it is that everybody actually gets the bread and gets offered this life and this love and this grace. And so it is everyone from Peter who also is given bread and is like held up as like the best disciple, though we have some qualms about calling him that. But so this particular passage shows like the breadth of Jesus' love, that it is like Jesus knows what's going to happen. Especially in the Gospel of John, Jesus is characterized as knowing everything and being in control of the whole thing. And so to extend the love and extend the bread to everyone from Peter to Judas is Jesus extending Jesus' love to everyone, and is kind of an argument against what we'll get to later in how Judas has since then been easily characterized as condemned to hell, because it's not really what Jesus does. But yeah, so after that, and after the meal, then when Jesus is in the garden, Judas goes with the soldiers to arrest Jesus, but doesn't do anything. And Jesus announces who he is to the soldiers on his own, asks who they're looking for, and says who he is, and they all fall down and on a knee and stuff. And then we don't see Judas again after that. So I think the tradition has definitely come up around Judas that he dies by suicide, but that, which comes from one of the Gospels, but is not necessarily all of the Gospels, and is in some ways a convenient thing for us to say, particularly if we're thinking about like the way that the Catholic Church has demonized suicide, and that's problematic in and of itself. And like, for the record, as a podcast, like, we don't think people, like, we would love for people to not die by suicide, and that does not condemn them. That does not destroy any hope of life or heaven or whatever may come after death.
Read Romans chapter 8. Nothing can separate us from the love of Christ.
Yeah.
And certainly not your actions.
Yeah.
We are not that powerful.
And that's a specific Christian interpretation, because Christians are the ones who are the worst at being condemning and judgy about that. So
sure. Well, and I mean, to be fair, there's a lot of us, and so we're the worst at lots of things, but
it's true. It's true. We are.
Yeah. I don't really know how else to put that. I think some of that is just the law of large numbers. So, speaking of numbers, we were going to do a section on Judas and the historical church, and it turns out that while there are a handful of people named Judas who aren't Judas Iscariot in the book of Acts, none of them are really like fleshed out. None of them really have, any other characteristics besides, and they lived here, and then one of the disciples went to see them, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
As it turns out, strangely enough, after Jesus's resurrection and ascension, Christians after that didn't really tend to name their kids Judas. Funny how that works. And so there aren't really a bunch of like people named Judas in the early church after that first generation, because they weren't using that name. Judah, yes, but not Judas, not the Greek version. So
yeah, my internship supervisor actually preached a sermon about like someday kids will be named Judas again. It was a really beautiful sermon. I really liked that one.
Yeah, that sounds lovely.
Yeah, one of the kind of most well-known works of literature connected to the historical church and Christianity in weird ways is Dante's Inferno. And that book was part of a trilogy. It is apparently, according to Kay, the most interesting part of the trilogy.
According to my high school English teacher.
There you go.
Yes.
I have read Dante's Inferno, as my college roommate can attest to. I have read it.
In translation, I'm guessing.
In translation, and I didn't finish it in time for the class, but I kept reading it because it was interesting, and I finished it later. It is one of like 2 books that I read for Pi Day. It was great. Anyway, Dante's Inferno does depict Judas in the ninth circle of hell. He is punished for all eternity, and he is frozen in the ninth circle of hell, being devoured by Lucifer. And he is alongside Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, who were the two leaders of the group of senators that assassinated Julius Caesar. So it's interesting because it's definitely characterized as like betrayal is the worst.
Yeah.
It just seems interesting that Julius Caesar gets like the two people who led the betrayal, and then only one betrayed Jesus. But it's just a fascinating like representation there of like how important Julius Caesar was, and the stories and legacies and myths and legends around him.
Yeah.
Also, Judas was an excuse for anti-Semitism in the historical church, which like everything was an excuse for anti-Semitism in the historical church. The historical church just has had a lot of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is bad. We will say it as many times as we need to. Anti-Semitism is bad. But in the historical church, the way that Judas has functioned within anti-Semitism is to become kind of the representative of Jewish people, right? And so when we talk about Judas, when Judas is portrayed, all of that stuff, it becomes Judas as the Jewish people who betrayed Jesus, when that's not what it is. Almost everybody in the Bible is Jewish. But that's part of why some of us have moved away from saying on the night in which he was betrayed, and instead say on the night before he died, on the night before Jesus died, for the words of institution, to kind of separate that out, that Judas is not just the betrayer, and like Jesus' death is not just being betrayed by Judas or by Jewish people. So
yeah. Personally speaking, I do use the "in the night he was betrayed" set of words for the words of institution, but that's because when I do it, I'm emphasizing more that, and despite being betrayed, Jesus still loved Judas. Jesus still cared about Judas. And so I keep that for a separate meaning. And I talk about that every Holy Week. But everybody makes their own decisions on that one. So.
And then we get to the Apocrypha, which we occasionally reference on this podcast, but we don't talk about a lot. The Apocrypha are a collection of writings that, as Protestants, we don't really use or reference. As Lutherans, we technically don't have a closed canon because Martin Luther said that anything that shines the light of Christ is gospel, is like fits in the canon. And he didn't think that Jude or James did, but others of us think they do and think other things don't. And so Lutherans don't have a canon, but other denominations do have a closed canon. And within Catholicism, the Apocrypha is part of the canon. So depending on what Bible you're looking at, particularly if you're looking at like an actual physical copy of the Bible, between the Hebrew scriptures or Old Testament and the Christian New Testament is the Apocrypha. And so we don't talk about it a lot because basically very rarely would a Revised Common Lectionary reading reference be from the Apocrypha. So just to have that. So within what we would say is probably non-canonical scripture or the Apocrypha, Judas does come up a couple times. So one of the references is in the Cainite sect, and that's Cainite like from Cain and Abel, which is part of the Gnostic tradition. And they thought that Judas was an instrument of the Sophia or divine wisdom, who we talked about in our Holy Trinity episode last year, and that Judas's betrayal of Jesus was a victory over the materialistic world. So that's an interpretation of that.
And a different one than our earlier comments about whether or not Judas's actions had to happen.
Yeah.
Like, that is not the same thing.
Yeah, it's not the same thing, but that's an interpretation of it. In the Syriac infancy gospel, there is a story about Judas as a boy being possessed by Satan, who then causes him to bite himself, or if other people are present, other people. And then at one point, young Jesus is by him, and he bites Jesus in the side, the same one that gets pierced later at the crucifixion. And by touching Jesus, then Satan is exorcised from Judas's body. So that's a fascinating story
Yeah,
about Judas and Jesus.
there's a reason why these things are the Apocrypha.
Yes. And then in the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Judas is a Coptic papyrus codex that was discovered near Beni Massa, Egypt, in the 1970s, and then kind of like rediscovered by people in 2006-ish. And it is a 3rd or 4th century copy of a 2nd century original. And in it is a conversation in which Jesus and Judas interact and discuss the nature of the universe, particularly from a Gnostic point of view. So there's a lot of Gnosticism and Judas connection. And there's a fair amount of controversy on the National Geographic translation, which is the 2006 being rediscovered, particularly initially from New Testament scholar Professor April de Konik. There's a lot on why this interpretation, why the translation. National Geographic didn't necessarily get great translators type of thing. It's a semi-interesting thing if you want to Google it. But yeah. And then the final reference is the Gospel of Barnabas. And the earliest copies of the Gospel of Barnabas are from medieval times. So much, much later than Jesus' time and then any of the other scripture that we read. And in the Gospel of Barnabas actually lines up a lot more with Islam's understanding of Jesus and Judas. And so in the Gospel of Barnabas, Judas was actually crucified on the cross, not Jesus. Judas' appearance was transformed to that of Jesus when he tried to betray him. But Jesus, as is part of Islamic tradition, Jesus had already ascended to the heavens by then. And so in the Gospel of Barnabas, after 3 days, Judas's body was stolen and rumors were spread about Jesus being risen from the dead. So Jesus, in the 3rd heaven, prayed for God to send him back. God sent him back. He told his mom, the disciples, and other followers the truth of what happened, and then headed back to heaven. So this one is, the Gospel of Barnabas is a very different ending to the Gospels and to Jesus' story that lines up a lot with what is in the Quran and what is told, what is part of Islamic beliefs.
Yeah. So more recently, let's talk about Judas and pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think my first thought when I think of the name Judas in terms of pop culture is the band Judas Priest, which was a British heavy metal band of the 1970s and 1980s. They had a ton of member turnover over the years, and they are perhaps also well known for the trial in 1990 in the United States about subliminal messages in their music, which happened after 2 young men tried to complete suicide, one of which succeeded, and their families blamed this band's music for it, and the case was dismissed after about a month and a half of a trial. The name of the band comes from Bob Dylan's song The Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, and it was suggested by Brian Bruno Stapenhill, who was one of the original band members, and the others agreed to it. So, also my dad's a big fan.
There we go. I was like, that's more than I have ever known about Judas Priest.
Also, they have a Wikipedia page, which is where most of that came from. But I grew up listening to classic rock, so.
Gotcha. That's fascinating. One of the other much more recent occurrences of Judas is in the name of the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, which is actually a 2021 biographical crime drama film, but it is a movie about the betrayal of Fred Hampton, chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s in Chicago, by William O'Neill, who was an FBI informant. So if you want some more insight into how the FBI is really awful, that would be a good movie to watch. But the FBI was really terrible to all of the Black Power movements and the civil rights movements in the 1960s especially. But Fred Hampton was a rising leader and star in the Black Panther Party, and so they targeted him intentionally. And
yeah,
that
he was 21 years old when he died.
Yep.
Also, if you want a list of characters in fiction or just in stories who have traits very similar to Judas, there is the trope Obvious Judas at tvtropes.org, which lists many characters who are very obviously going to turn traitor at some point in the story, pretty much from the beginning. And one of the most, frankly, obvious examples of this is Cypher from the first Matrix movie, who is frankly just shifty from the start. Like, I'm not actually big on describing characters as shifty, but clearly this guy is intentionally going for that, and just wants out of the Matrix and back into the simulation.
Yeah. And another like kind of sub-categorization in the obvious Judas trope is when the obvious Judas trope combines with the red herring trope. And so then you get like someone who is very suspicious, but then it turns out that they're like a good guy all along or working for good all along. And so one of those would be Billy Butcherson in Hocus Pocus, where Winifred brings him back from the dead and they like think that he's trying to hurt them and harm them, and his mouth is like sewn shut so he can't talk. And then when he finally like is able to talk, he is like, no, I don't like them, and works against them, and it like is really helpful. So there's a fun one, but there's a lot more, and we'll include the link to the obvious Judas trope in our episode description for you to find more about that.
Yeah.
So Judas, not all bad. But yeah, Judas is not all bad. Doesn't necessarily deserve all of what has been put upon him over the millennia.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for our readings for this episode, we are doing something that we do most years for Palm Sunday. We'll do the Palm Gospel and then the Isaiah and Philippians readings. And then for what would be like leading into Passion and Holy Week, we'll just do the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew for the Passion story up until the Last Supper, just to like lead you into Holy Week. So our first reading is Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. Jesus arrives in Jerusalem on a donkey and colt and makes a triumphant entrance. So one of the themes in this passage is, perhaps obviously, parades. Parades, basically. Yeah, pride parades, marches, protests, the song March, March by the Chicks. Parades are so very connected to resistance and celebration, particularly in the face of oppression. And so that's part of the connection here. And we talk more about that in our first Palm Sunday episode with Lenny Duncan. So
that was a great episode.
Yeah, we'll link to that as well.
Jesus probably did not have like gigantic floats or balloons or ticker tape at that parade, though. That seems unlikely.
Probably not. I think parades have kind of gotten away from the like triumph over evil, resistance of evil, and are more like semi-creepy
excuses for high school bands to play for people marching down the street.
I was thinking of semi-creepy nationalism. But
I mean, to be fair, the parades I've gone to in the last like 10 years have all been like small town parades that were mostly focused on throwing children candy, and occasionally the shiners would drive by in their tiny little cars.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So in verse 5, as we dive into the verses themselves, we read, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And I could not for the life of me remember where I heard this the first time, but I am fairly certain that I have heard a theory that this is actually a too literal translation of the original intention, and that originally the meaning was that Jesus was going to be riding a donkey, more specifically a baby donkey that is a foal. But the disciples pulling an Amelia Bedelia feels very on brand for them, and that is totally in character. So, I can't argue. That's fine.
It does feel super in character for them to pull an Amelia Bedelia. I had heard it as, it's part of Matthew, right? And I think it's part of the like Matthew's translation of things, where like instead of saying young girl, Matthew translates through things and it's virgin. It's a similar thing that like there is a Hebrew poetry technique that we read in the Psalms all the time that's like one line and then intensifying for the next
Yes.
line. So it's saying the same thing, but more intensely. And so mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Like, it's just an
Yes.
intensifying, like.
But the image of Jesus trying to ride two animals at the same time is pretty hilarious. Personally, I've always been a fan of the sitting on the grown-up donkey and then using the baby donkey as a footstool image, if you're going to go for that, as opposed to like actually trying to ride astride of both of them at the same time, which frankly just would hurt.
So, speaking of that, in verse 7, we read, they brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. And I was like, definitely a theater of the absurd thing, watching one grown man try to sit on both a full-grown donkey and a colt. I do like I think the footstool kind of works, but also part of me wants, like, because of the theater of the absurd, right, wants me to have the butt on the colt and then the headrest, like, or like,
oh, I like that.
leaning an elbow on the
on the grown up.
Yeah.
Sure. Or maybe just like full on surfing and one foot on either of them and just trying to balance between the two.
Doing like a circus act.
Yeah. Hopefully putting most of your weight on the grown up donkey, because I don't know that the baby donkey would, but yes.
Yeah. That's the tricky part, is like,
yeah,
we want to keep the baby donkey safe.
Right. Absolutely. That's Nerds at Church for you, you know, putting the emphasis where it really matters.
Keeping baby donkeys safe.
Absolutely, yes.
Right?
Along with murder bad.
Yes. Murder bad. Baby donkeys safe. Speaking of baby donkeys, though, please, dear listeners, send us all of the pictures you can possibly have, no more than one per actual animal, of baby animals. We need them.
We are looking for baby animal pictures, baby animal gifs. Not necessarily baby animal videos. That's a little much. But gifs or photos would be great.
Gifs
or for that matter, like if there's a piece of artwork that has baby animals in it that you really like, that's cool too. It doesn't have to be a photo.
Yeah. We want all that you can send us. You can send them to us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com, or you can post it on our social media. We have a Twitter ask out for it that has not really gotten some responses, but you can also respond to like this episode with pictures of animals. We're fine with that.
Yes,
Facebook,
absolutely.
Twitter,
please go ahead.
Wherever.
And
Send
like
us
to
your
be
pictures.
fair, this is an ask because we are specifically looking for them for a future episode in the near future. But, you know, if you ever want to share baby animal photos with us, we're really not going to object to that. That's cool.
It's true. Sure. It's true. We'd like some urgency on this, but also if you're listening to this
in the future,
after we've come out with the as yet still mysterious somewhat episode, send them anyway, because we like them.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on. In verse 9a, we read, the crowds that went ahead of Jesus and that followed were shouting. And they were basically praising Jesus and calling him the Son of David. Whereas in a few days, a crowd will call for his execution. So I think it's important to keep in mind at this point that these were almost certainly completely different groups of people. Like, Jerusalem's a large city, okay? This is not a small town where the same 15 people follow Jesus around all day. And so it's not like in Beauty and the Beast when the same small town sings pleasantly about Belle at the beginning of the movie and then half an hour later unites with Gaston to lock her dad up forever in a mental institution. Like, that's kind of a swing of mood and character that seems unlikely. So this is not what's going on.
But also mob mentality.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
And probably they weren't singing Disney songs in ancient Palestine, although I suppose we wouldn't know because it's not like we would have recordings of them because Disney doesn't allow for that kind of thing. So
I was going to say, although they might have been singing to Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes.
Which
absolutely
was last year's Palm Sunday episode, so you can definitely check that out if you want to explore Jesus Christ Superstar with our special guest, friend of the podcast, Andrea Garnett.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in verse 10, we read, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, who is this? And I just got my favorite 3-year-old game for her birthday. That's like Guess Who, but it's better. It's called Who's She? You should definitely look it up. But so now I'm picturing just like rows and rows of like random people and then like the Jesus, and you're like trying to guess like, who is this?
Looking for Jesus like Where's Waldo?
Like Where's Waldo, but like asking questions and be like,
yes.
Is this person have dark hair? Yes. Is this person fed a bunch of people with not enough food? Yes. It's great. Hushi is like all famous people, and so you actually like learn stuff about them, which is why I
Oh,
think
cool.
it's awesome. So yeah, that's what I'm picturing now is just a bunch of like who's she guessing at who Jesus is.
Yeah. So our First Testament reading for this episode is from Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 through 9a. God's servant remains confident in God, whatever trial they face.
So, one of the themes for this passage is the idea of worth, that no matter what happens, the servant is worthy because of God, and their worth is not dependent on how the people who are beating them up treat them or any of those sorts of things. So, it reminded me of the book series Cinder, and in Cinder, at the beginning especially, there's this discrimination that cyborgs, who are mostly human but also part machine, are made to feel less than humans.
Yeah.
And there's this like really complicated, like this messed up reasoning for it, but the reality and the truth that like comes out later is that they are valuable and have inherent worth, and Cinder in particular has extra worth. And so there's this like irony juxtaposition of like made to feel like you are less than, but it's actually like because you are so wonderful and important. So
Yeah.
yeah. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 6 we read, I gave my back to those who struck me and my cheeks to those who pulled out the beard. I did not hide my face from insult and spitting. And this reminded me vividly of the final episode of Kindred, which is the FX movie that got canceled after a month because racism is that's my explanation. Whether or not it was, that very much feels like it. But the final episode of, and it's based on the book Kindred by Octavia Butler, which is a fantastic book. And in that episode, Dana's mom does not hide herself, but gives her back to those who strike her, specifically to protect Dana, who is being whipped. That just seemed like a good, like it just feels so much like that.
Yeah, it really does. It's also just very sad.
Yeah.
And then in verse 7 we read, The Lord God helps me, therefore I have not been disgraced. Therefore I have set my face like flint, and I know that I shall not be put to shame. And the phrase setting your face like flint is not really one we use anymore, but my understanding is that it means that you have chosen a course of action and you are determined about it. And so this made me think of Steve McQueen's character in The Great Escape movie, who tries to escape from the POW camp over and over again and is recaptured again and again. And at the very end of the movie, in fact, the movie ends on his character, it's made clear that he is still determined to try again. So he does not give up.
Yeah. I definitely saw McQueen and was thinking of Lightning McQueen, and I was like,
yes, no.
okay,
I mean, named
like,
after, but not the same.
Yeah, the race car can like be determined not to.
I mean, I'm sure, Alexander McQueen of the fashion house is also very determined, but in a completely different way. So
Sure, yeah, totally. And then in verse 8 we read, the one who vindicates me is near. Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who are my adversaries? Let them confront me. And this actually reminded me of President Bartlett in West Wing, when he is like, he has been just like not himself because his daughter was kidnapped, and there's a new Speaker of the House and all of that stuff. And so he, like the new Speaker of the House and all that, they're fighting, and the government has been shut down because of a standstill and all of this stuff. And then President Bartlett finally like gets his gumption back. And I think that's the right use of the word. It just feels right.
yeah, that feels right. I love that
go
episode.
Yeah, and then like goes to Congress to knock on the speaker's door, and is like, and they're like, oh, I don't know if we should do this. And then like he gets out and walks halfway, and like people are following him and like taking pictures and all of this stuff. And he goes to confront the Speaker of the House, and knocks, and the speaker's like, oh, we don't know what to do. And then they end up leaving. Yeah. And the speaker comes out and nobody's there, and it's like, oops. And that's this like pivotal moment where it's like, oh no, President Bartlett has power. And
yeah, Yeah, that was a great moment. And then in verse 9, we read, "It is the Lord God who helps me. Who will declare me guilty? All of them will wear out like a garment. The moth will eat them up." And this verse always reminds me of a bit from the very beginning of the book Dune, where the main character's dad uses what they call a family code during a dinner party, because they have, I think, a handful, like maybe 5 or 6 of these codes of just using 2 specific words close together while talking to people, say, chatting at a dinner party. And whatever those 2 words are and which order you use them in tells you what the secret message is, basically. And so in this code, one of the words is garment, and he uses another word very closely in proximity to that word. And then that is telling both his family members and also their employees who are around, like the security guards, to relax and that they are not in danger. And so that stuck with me for some reason, and it reminded me.
Nice. Also, a reminder that you may or may not hear that second half depending on how people get their 9A situated.
Details, as someone has been known to say.
Exactly. I mean, the place that we get our verses from doesn't cut off half the verse.
Yeah.
So we just get them all.
We're being inclusive.
Yeah, that's what we're calling it these days. And then our next reading is from Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11. The earliest Christian hymn we have record of. These verses describe Christ's willingness to join with humanity rather than lord divinity over us, even when it meant death on the cross. So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of humble exaltation, that there is this like humbleness to Jesus, but then also this like greatness. And I really love Laia from the Ember in the Ashes series, which I just finished, as an example of this, because she does have this growth from, I mean, she is a scholar, she is oppressed, she becomes a slave, like literally humble to the point of humiliation. And then she grows into owning her own power and her own agency and her own worth. And it's just like this beautiful arc for her.
Yeah. So in verse 5, we read, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." And I don't know, is Jesus thinking that there are plenty of other passages about Jesus in the Bible, and maybe we could read one of them occasionally instead of reading the Christ hymn again? Don't get me wrong, this is a good Bible passage. Like, I'm not saying this is a bad Bible passage. I'm not saying don't read it at all. But we have heard this a lot. And so if Jesus is thinking that, I am certainly in the same mind as Jesus. Maybe we could revise the Revised Common Lectionary one more time for a little less repetition, because I think we've heard this one like 4 times in the last year, it feels like. So if we could like maybe not use this one and also Psalm 23 quite as often, that would be great.
And maybe at the Isaiah passage too.
Yeah.
Just throw that one in
there. Yeah. It reminds me of how every time that someone wants to invoke the Lord of the Rings in other like TV or movies or something, the theme that they always play is the theme of the Shire, which like there is a lot of other music to Lord of the Rings, but it feels like anytime someone wants to, bring that into a scene for some reason, it's always the Shire music. And like, that's not the only music from Lord of the Rings. There are lots of options.
And here, I was thinking you were going to say whenever someone wants to invoke Lord of the Rings, they bring up lembas bread. And I was going to be like, because it's amazing.
Well, lembas bread would be great if it actually existed, and it's a cool concept for the books. But yes.
Details.
And also, I wouldn't complain about you on the podcast, Emily. I saved that for off the podcast.
Wow.
That would be rude. I would not be rude.
Okay, I know you like doing ministry in the Midwest, and you're good at it. But maybe don't try so hard to fit in.
Okay, there's that.
I also looked at verse 5, and I was like, okay, what mind? Like in the show Travelers, where like they transport their consciousness back into the body of someone who's about to die, and then their mind is a traveler's mind. That kind of mind? Mm-hmm.
See, it's interesting that you mentioned the word traveler, because I have recently started watching the second campaign of Critical Role on YouTube, and the traveler is one of the minor deities who shows up in their D&D world, and the traveler is basically like a jokester or trickster character. And so the idea of Jesus being a trickster god Actually, like, I want to see that gospel. That would be awesome.
Oh my gosh, that would be fantastic. I mean, there is a like trickster interpretation of Jesus' resurrection as like,
Yes, the best trick God
yeah.
ever pulled. Yeah.
My favorite time to preach that is on April Fool's Day, when like the one
Yeah,
time, but the one time that Easter was on April 1st, I
that
was
was
not
great.
in a congregation. I didn't get to
Oh.
preach it. I was so
Yeah, I don't
sad.
think I did either, come to think of it. But
I was so
yeah.
sad.
And then in verse 7a, we read, "But emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness." And, okay, Jesus was a second class citizen in his own country as an Israelite under the Roman military occupation. That is
Mm-hmm.
true, that is fair. But he wasn't actually a slave. He wasn't born a slave. He did not become a slave. Like, I mean, he was
Mm-hmm.
crucified. That was not great, let's be clear. But,
Murder bad.
like, yeah, murder's still bad. And I get that the author is actually trying to talk about humans being slaves to God's will and also, like, willingly following God for, essentially no pay, I guess. That's probably not where that metaphor is meant to go. But this phrase could use some unpacking, especially in an American context, what with our history. Like,
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking, I am not in favor of replacing the word slave in the Bible with another term, because usually when they say slave, they mean slave, but in this case, not really. Like, this is a rare exception to that rule, and so this might actually be
Yeah.
one of those times when replacing it with servant wouldn't be a terrible idea. I admit I have not spent a ton of time thinking this over, but it seems more reasonable than it usually would.
Yeah, I also looked at that verse and I was like, well, in Kindred, again, Dana takes on the form of a literal slave, but that is not a willingly thing. It's an unwillingly thing. And
Yeah.
yeah, to have this, particularly in our context in the United States, but also like just in general, there is no space in which we are enslaved to God. Like, that's, even if it's you're doing God's will without pay, like, it's volunteering. Like, that's not the same as that. And so I think servant, because I do think that, like, especially with the Isaiah passage and the ways that Christianity reads itself into scripture where Jesus isn't actually being referred to, there's a lot of like Jesus as servant, or just looking at Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Like, Jesus as servant works, Jesus as slave does not.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 25. Judas's betrayal of Jesus bookends the preparations for the Passover meal that Jesus and the disciples will share before the crucifixion.
So, one of the themes in this passage is betrayal. What a surprise. And what I'm right now, well, I'm paused because we're recording this during the trans rights readathon. So, not really watching anything except for reading books and listening to audiobooks. But
Sure.
outside of this week of the trans rights readathon, I'm rewatching Doctor Who, but also like splicing it in with classic Doctor Who on Pace's advice and guidance. And so one of the first Dalek storyline definitely like plays right into this like idea of betrayal, where the Daleks plan to betray the humans and the Doctor betray the Daleks. And so there's this like plenty of betrayal to go around because the humans like
Yeah.
get captured by the Daleks, and so they're like, we're not going to trust you to actually like want to be in good faith with these other people. You clearly have malicious intent. But they also kind
Yeah.
of talk about maybe they don't. I don't know. Yeah,
I mean, generally speaking, trusting Daleks never really seems to be a good plan.
it's true. But this was the first time Daleks
Yeah, fair.
were
But as we have discovered
in the
since.
Doctor. Yeah,
Yeah.
every time then and every time since, except for like there's one episode in the first season, right, where the Dalek like
Oh, with Christopher Eccleston.
yeah,
Yes,
where
but
the
that
Dalek
wasn't a
like bonds
pure
with
Dalek,
Rose.
as that becomes a whole thing. Complicated.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
So in verse 15, we read, "And said," Judas said, basically, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver. So I went in and did some math, and
Of course you did. I love math, and you
yes,
got to do the math. I'm so happy with you and a little bit jealous.
Well, I think as we talk about math, usually I am the one doing the arithmetic stuff because the arithmetic stuff is what I was trained to like and be interested in.
Mm.
And you are usually one for more of the higher math kind of thing.
I do like the higher math. As long as it's
Yeah.
not geometry. I have terrible spatial reasoning.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I did not do that great in geometry either.
Algebra, though. Bread and butter.
Sure. But the arithmetic being more of my kind of thing, I looked into it, and according to that lovely ancient resource Wikipedia, these pieces of silver were most likely either Tyrian shekels or Antioch staters, which in either case would be worth probably just less than 350 American dollars today, all 30 of them together, that is, which is a large amount of money, but also not going to, massively change your life. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And let's be clear, the inflation rate and everything, that's not exact math. This is why earlier we said that this is a noticeable amount of money. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
something you might go out of your way for, but it's also not going to set you up for life. That's basically the description we can give. And just for fun, I decided to compare that to the worth of denarius, which is the other commonly known coin in the Bible that we hear about a lot,
Mm-hmm.
because one denarius was often the pay for a laborer
For
in
a
biblical
day.
times. For one day, yeah, for one day's work. And it was a Roman coin. And again, the inflation rate is not exactly equal, but they were guessing that in 2013 it would be worth about $20. And I actually used an inflation calculator to update that to today, and now it would be about $26 in modern money, and that would be per coin. And so if he'd been paid in denarii rather than in silver coins, 30 denarii, that would have been more than twice the amount of money worth. That translates to about $780.
That's fascinating because if you translate instead a denarius to the original, like thinking about minimum wage in an
Sure.
8-hour work week, a denarius would be worth basically like 8 times
An eight
that.
an 8 hour work day, I think you mean.
Work day. Yeah, sorry. An 8
Yes.
hour work day for a denarius. The original, and then adjusted for inflation, would be like $200 per denarius. So that would
Yeah.
be like a chunk
Yeah.
of money, which, would be one way to refill the coffers, since the disciples were complaining about money in the preceding story of the woman anointing Jesus' feet.
Yes, but
It's
also if you
an
believe the
option.
story that Judas was stealing from them, it wouldn't be the disciples' coffers getting refilled.
It's true, except that's a different gospel. But
Well,
it
yes, that's right.
does still have a fair amount of the flavor of Scrooge and Marley in A Christmas Carol
Yeah,
pre ghost
although
visits.
not the Muppet Christmas Carol because there's no dancing.
It's true, there's no dancing in this one, and the Muppets Christmas Carol doesn't go into the full sus experience of Scrooge and what he did to get the money he got.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then in verse 21, we read, "And while they were eating, Jesus said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me.'" And I have to say, Jesus, this is the worst murder mystery dinner party ever. Like, this is not how those are supposed to go. Well, okay, there's plenty of drama in the rest of the story, but not during the supper. And I've been thinking lately, I've been sort of wanting to try one of those, like, solve a mystery in a box subscriptions. They sound kind of fun and sort of up my alley. But I'm honestly kind of worried that they're all just going to turn out to be, this is murdered woman number 1, this is murdered woman number 2, this is murdered woman number 476. And that is actually what turned me off of the TV show Criminal Minds, which I used to really like, but it was just, one murdered woman after another, basically. And so if anybody has heard of if they're all like that, or if there's a particular company that makes those that doesn't do that, I would be
Kill all the men.
interested in hearing about it. Well, not necessarily kill all the men, but some variety, for crying out loud. Like, I actually have talked to my husband about, there is a podcast that he likes that's crime and sports. And it's not honestly like the greatest quality podcast. It's made by the same people who do Small Town Murders, which is much more popular. And it's not the most fascinating podcast, but it's basically stories about professional athletes who then turn to crime and how did that happen, basically. And the thing is that, like, some of their crimes are violent, some of them aren't, and not all of the violence is against women. Like, it's a healthy mix of both men and women. And so at least it's
God.
not just constant dead women. I'm just saying. And so like that's part of the reason why I actually like that podcast, because there
Kay.
was variety. And
Okay, dear listeners, Kay, who coined the phrase murder bad, is
murder is bad.
advocating for more egalitarian murder.
Stop fridging women. I'm just saying, even if it's true crime. Yeah, I'm not really a true crime person, in part because of this, because so much true crime focuses on, frankly, dead women. And so, I just ask for a little variety. That's all I'm asking for. So if anybody knows if there's a company that does like more variety than that, or maybe not all murders, maybe sometimes it's just stealing, that would be fine.
Right? Embezzling. Yeah. We could go after catching embezzlers. That'd be great.
Absolutely. Art theft. Absolutely. Sure.
One, there's a TikToker who does crime and cookies, and while she decorates a cookie, she tells a true crime story about some like not very well heard of criminal guy.
I'm still not getting TikTok, but that is kind of sadly interesting. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Next time she comes across my feed, I'll send it to you. Also, your comments reminded me of Glass Onion. Have you seen that movie?
I have heard about it. I have not seen it.
It's fantastic. And the person, like...
Is that the sequel to Knives Out?
I think so. It's a sequel to something that I haven't seen. I think it's a Knives Out movie. I was surprised at how much I liked it.
Daniel Craig plays somebody with a weird accent?
Sure. I don't know the names of actors.
Okay. Sure. He was James Bond. But
sure. Oh, he did look like a guy that might have been James Bond once.
I love our podcast so much. I'm just saying.
Me too. But there is a murder mystery aspect to the whole, I guess, all the Knives Out, but like that particular, everybody gets invited to this island for a weekend, and the guy like plans this murder mystery thing. So the like, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me was like almost exactly a line. Not exactly, but like yeah. So it's worth watching. There's, still potential that you'll be disappointed about things, but yeah. And then in verse 25, we read, Judas, who betrayed Jesus, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." Jesus replied, "You have said so." And I was talking to a friend of the podcast, Toby, who has not been on the podcast, but also might have been heard giggling a couple minutes ago. And they brought up this, like, did Judas have second thoughts? And this, like, is this surely not I, Rabbi, Judas' second thoughts of, like, I won't actually go through with this, will I? Kind of thing. Which, like, then we see later in this gospel that, like, Judas does have second thoughts and does have regret about what he did.
I mean, that's an option. I suppose another option would be, like, a full-on psychotic break.
That feels more complicated and more problematic as an interpretation because of the ways that people make...
Or if he was actually possessed by Satan, then not in control.
That seems like a better interpretation, just because most people with mental illness and neurodivergence are victims
violent
of crime instead of
more likely to
perpetrators. Yeah. But so I was thinking about this and I was like, oh, it's like classic Doctor Who, because I'm watching it.
Sure.
And the censorites. And there's this like back and forth that keeps happening. And I think I'm still like in the middle of the like story arc thing, but the back and forth between the Doctor and the censorites is like to help or not to help. Will they harm or not harm? And like all of these second guessing and second thoughts back and forth as the plot like develops. Yeah. And now for our most redemptive segment.
Absolutely.
Let's make a Muppets musical. Kay, who are you casting for this episode?
So there's some disagreement between the various Gospels with the Palm Sunday parade. Like, was there any advanced planning at all? Or was it just like everybody showed up and woo, let's start yelling and throwing cloaks on the ground and stuff and waving palm branches? And in this Gospel, in Matthew's Gospel, we do get the sense that there's like a very brief amount of planning ahead, in that the disciples have to go get the colts. The donkey and the foal, because that totally makes sense. And so I'm trying to think of like, yes, cast the various disciples as Muppets. And I'm just going to, in passing, say I am not on board with casting Judas as a Muppet. I think Judas has to be a person. Mostly because I don't think any of the Muppets could pull that off. Or I wouldn't want them to, frankly. But I'm trying to think of, like, okay, send a couple of the Muppets. You could send almost any of the Muppets to go get the animals. That's fine. But I'm asking myself, who would be, like, the Muppet who would then be in charge of rounding up the crowds and getting them ready for a parade and making sure that they all have cloaks and palms and stuff that they can, use effectively and energetically. And of course that's Miss Piggy, right? Like, that is absolutely her time to shine. And so I think that Miss Piggy is the Palm Sunday parade planner, and she is the one rounding up the crowds and getting them all revved up and ready to go. And I think she'd have a grand old time.
That is fantastic, and I love it. I was thinking, and I have been sitting on this for about, actually probably only like a week, but in my head for a little longer than that, of John Oliver as a villain in Let's Make a Muppets Musical. He would just do so well at it, right?
I think he could. Would he keep the British accent, or would he, like, try to do something else?
Of course. Yeah, okay. British accent.
Well, yeah, I mean, the best villains all have British accents, obviously.
It's true. It's true.
It's the whole Empire thing. But
yeah. So this goes against, like, my actual interpretation of Judas as not an evil villain, but also...
Although, if it's John Oliver, because he's so good at both the evil British accent and comedy, could we give him a mustache to twirl?
Oh, absolutely. Like, he gets a mustache to twirl.
Yes, excellent.
Who do you take me for, Kay?
Okay, I was pretty sure you'd be fine with that, but I thought I should check. It doesn't have to be, like, a good quality mustache. Like, really, if you're going to use fake mustaches, I am generally on board with the, like, really terrible quality cheapo ones.
Oh, yeah. No. And have it, like, be... Oh my gosh. And then he could be twirling it, and at one point, like, it kind of tugs a little and, like, starts to come off.
Yeah. Exactly. That's perfect.
Oh my gosh. We have
set the scene beautifully.
Because there is, like, the slimmest chance that he will, like, see it and be like, oh my gosh.
Or one of his interns. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll re-release our previous Monday, Thursday episodes, and then our next episode that we will record new for the podcast this year will be looking for nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Easter Vigil with our special guest, Rabbi Becky Silverstein. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's definitely cheaper than betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver.
Yes. Whether or not you fall down in a field and your guts gush out.
Also true. Thank you for that addition, Kay.
Well, I was just thinking that, like, actually, it wasn't expensive for Judas to, like, Judas got paid, so technically...
True.
Anyway.
He got paid, and then he paid with his life.
Well, depending on which one you read, yes. Okay, so on that note, also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said, Pax Vobiscum.